in a small house in Fairbury, Nebraska, where everything looked completely normal from the outside, but behind. What happened next was not a moment of impulse, but a series of painful days that followed. The only person there was his wife. And when the police finally arrived, Thomas De Jong was no longer alive.
Number 1. Susan Marie De Jong. On the night of March 11, 2011, the quiet rural area of Jefferson County, Nebraska, was suddenly shattered by an emergency call. On the other end of the line was a woman named Susan Marie De Jong, struggling to speak through broken breaths. Her voice trembled with panic, as if she could hardly process what she was seeing. Susan told the dispatcher that her husband, Thomas, was no longer breathing. She described his condition as extremely severe, as though his body had been subjected to an overwhelming and unexplained force. This did not sound like a typical accident report. It sounded more like a desperate cry from someone standing at the edge of devastating loss. As the dispatcher tried to calm her, Susan repeated only one thing: her husband was fading inside their own home. Hours later, Thomas De Jong was pronounced dead. And at that moment, no one yet realized that what appeared to be a plea for help would soon become the doorway to a far more unsettling truth. Thomas De Jong, 52 years old, was not a man who drew attention. He was quiet, hardworking, and deeply principled, rarely raising his voice. Family members and co-workers described Thomas as gentle and dependable, the kind of person who always showed up on time and stayed until the job was done. After many years living in South Dakota, Thomas and Susan moved to a small rental home in rural Nebraska, hoping to start a calmer, more stable life. He took on part-time work assisting at a local farm, steady physical labor that reflected his own nature. To those around them, their marriage appeared peaceful, free of conflict or drama. But behind closed doors, that silence slowly became a weight. Thomas was not someone who knew how to push back, either with words or actions. And sometimes, the kindest people are the ones who endure the longest until they no longer have the chance to speak for themselves. When emergency responders arrived at the De Jong home, the atmosphere inside felt unusually heavy. Thomas was lying still, his body already cooling, with no detectable pulse. At a glance, the medical team understood this was not a routine emergency. They observed extensive signs of physical distress across his body, areas of discoloration, swelling and surface injuries extending from head to toe, suggesting prolonged strain rather than a single incident. As resuscitation efforts began, the silence of the room was broken only by medical equipment and the urgent movements of those trying to hold on to what little time remained. For a brief moment, Thomas's heart responded. But it was fragile and short-lived. Even the most experienced responders sensed something was wrong. These findings did not align with an accident, nor did they resemble a spontaneous altercation. Instead, they pointed to a deeper story, one of sustained hardship, quiet endurance, and a man who had been carrying far more than anyone realized long before help was finally called. While Thomas was fighting to survive in the hospital, Susan continued to recount her version of events. She claimed that a few days earlier, her husband had left home under the pretense of looking for work, but had actually gone to meet another woman. Susan described this person as a third party and blamed her for everything that followed. According to Susan, Thomas had been severely mistreated by this woman and, despite being in critical condition, somehow managed to drive hundreds of miles back home. She told the story with visible desperation, as if she herself needed it to make sense of what was happening. But to doctors and medical staff, the explanation did not hold up. Those experienced with serious physical trauma understood that a body in such condition would not be capable of driving, walking, or even remaining fully conscious. The gap between Susan's account and the medical reality grew increasingly difficult to ignore. And in that moment, suspicion began to take shape quietly, but firmly enough that it could no longer be dismissed. The following day, investigators entered the home where Thomas De Jong had collapsed. The house was quiet to an unsettling degree, but the silence could not conceal what had taken place. Evidence was not confined to a single area. Instead, signs of distress appeared throughout the home in the living room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and even the basement. More than 70 separate indicators were documented, scattered like fragments of a story that refused to fade. What stood out most to investigators was the absence of any single concentrated area. Instead, they noted faint patterns, marks suggesting movement, and areas that appeared to have been hastily cleaned. In the bathroom, towels and cleaning cloths were found bearing traces of what had been wiped away, pointing to a desperate attempt to erase what had happened. From a forensic perspective, this was not the scene of someone who had simply returned home injured. It was a space where prolonged turmoil had unfolded, chaotic, deliberate, and contained within those walls. Physical evidence does not fabricate stories. It records movement, struggle, and the moments when events crossed an irreversible line. That house was not only where Thomas's life ended. It was where the truth began to surface. Investigators soon turned their attention to Susan's white pickup truck. Inside, they discovered a red duffel bag hidden from view. What it contained began to clarify the situation piece by piece. Inside were clothing, personal belongings, and Thomas's wallet. There were also 2 hammers. One showed signs of having been used earlier. Both the tool and a set of sleepwear carried trace evidence connected to both Thomas and Susan. To prosecutors, these were no longer random items, they were central to the case. Yet what left the jury truly silent was not only the physical evidence. It was a message Susan had sent to her son before Thomas died. In it, she wrote that she was thinking about getting rid of Tom, that she could no longer endure the situation, and that she felt herself losing control. Those words could no longer be dismissed as fleeting emotion. They became intent. When physical evidence, tools, and written statements converged, the question was no longer what had happened, but why Thomas was never given a chance to escape what was coming. The autopsy results brought all remaining debate to an end. Thomas De Jong's body showed clear signs of prolonged and severe physical trauma. There were multiple fractures, internal injuries, and lung collapse. Most notably, a small bone in the neck had been broken, an uncommon injury that medical experts explained is typically associated with extreme pressure to the airway. Forensic doctors stated that Thomas had endured significant suffering for hours, possibly even days, before his life came to an end. In the courtroom, Susan Marie De Jong sat in silence as each detail was read aloud. The jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. Susan was found guilty of first-degree murder, along with an additional enhancement related to the use of a weapon. She broke down in tears, insisting that everything had been misunderstood. But for Thomas's family, the truth was already painfully clear. Addressing Susan directly, the judge stated that Thomas had suffered in isolation and that she had failed to help him when there was still time. Susan Marie De Jong was sentenced to life in prison, with additional years added. The case was closed, but its impact remained. A gentle man was lost quietly, and a marriage that once appeared ordinary ended in an irreversible tragedy. Number 2. Niko Jenkins. On July 30, 2013, Niko A. Jenkins quietly walked out of a Nebraska prison. There were no cameras, no public warnings, and little attention. Within days, however, a sense of fear began to spread across Omaha. In the span of just 10 days, 4 innocent people lost their lives. These were not accidents, nor were they impulsive acts. They were part of a deliberate sequence carried out with intention, selection, and a chilling absence of hesitation. By the time police recognized the connection between the cases, the city understood something deeply unsettling. They were dealing with someone who had no interest in hiding. He was not trying to escape notice. He wanted his actions to be known. And he wanted to be seen. Niko Jenkins never had a normal childhood. From an early age, instability followed him closely. At just 7 years old, Jenkins brought a firearm to an elementary school, an incident that immediately set him apart as a serious concern. What followed were years spent moving through juvenile facilities, correctional institutions, and psychiatric hospitals. His record included armed offenses, repeated assaults, and threats of severe harm. He was intelligent and articulate, but deeply driven by anger. Some mental health professionals diagnosed him with serious psychological disorders. Others believed he exaggerated symptoms to manipulate the system. But on one point, there was no disagreement. Jenkins posed an extreme risk. When he was released without close supervision or consistent treatment, it was not a true chance at reintegration. It was a gamble, one that placed the safety of others at stake. On August 11, 2013, two young men were lured to a park in Omaha under the promise of meeting women. As they sat inside their vehicle, Jenkins emerged from the darkness. What followed happened without warning and without conversation. The encounter was swift and deliberate. Afterward, Jenkins searched their belongings, took cash, and left the scene behind. The victims were left where they were found, treated with a chilling lack of regard. The method and precision deeply unsettled investigators. This was not a typical robbery. It reflected total control, planned, intentional, and calculated. 8 days later, Jenkins continued. This time, the victim was someone he had known from a previous time in custody. The man was drawn in with the promise of working together on a criminal plan. But once they arrived, the encounter ended abruptly. It was a cold and deliberate elimination. Then, on August 21, the city truly woke up. Andrea Kruger, a mother of 3, was forcibly removed from her vehicle in broad daylight and killed simply because Jenkins wanted her car. There was no prior connection, no personal motive, just the wrong place at the wrong time. Fear spread quickly across the city. Investigators believed that if Jenkins was not stopped immediately, more lives would be lost. On August 29, 2013, Jenkins was taken into custody while carrying a weapon. He did not resist. He showed no signs of fear or urgency, as if events were unfolding exactly as he expected. For Jenkins, taking lives was not an act driven by desperation. It was a decision calculated, intentional, and made without hesitation. In court, Jenkins turned the proceedings into a spectacle. He laughed, spoke in unfamiliar phrases, and claimed that his actions were carried out under the command of an ancient Egyptian serpent deity known as Apophis. While in custody, he engaged in extreme behavior and marked his body in unusual ways, attempting to present himself as mentally unstable. However, mental health experts were not persuaded. After thorough evaluation, they concluded that Jenkins was fully aware of his actions, understood their consequences, and chose to proceed regardless. This was not the result of confusion or loss of reality. It was deliberate harm, carried out with clear awareness and intent. Niko A. Jenkins was sentenced to death, but the verdict did not apply to one individual alone. It exposed a serious failure in Nebraska's post-release supervision system. A person with a well-documented history of dangerous behavior had been released without sufficient oversight or safeguards. 4 lives were lost as a result. Jenkins was held accountable, but the larger question remains. How many more tragedies could occur if clear warning signs continue to be overlooked? Number 3. Monnique Lee. On October 17, 2010, in Omaha, Nebraska, a woman left her home to meet a potential tenant. It was something she had done hundreds of times before. No one could have known that what seemed like a routine appointment would become the final trap of her life. Karen Jenkins entered the apartment with the familiar belief that she was helping another family find a place to live. Hours later, she vanished, and when the truth finally came to light, the city was left in shock, confronted by the severity of a case driven not by theft, but by deep-seated resentment. Karen Jenkins was more than a landlord. She was a university instructor, a businesswoman, and someone who deeply believed in second chances. For tenants facing hardship, Karen often reduced rent, allowed delayed payments, and sometimes even created job opportunities to help them stay afloat. She believed that kindness could change people. Her family described Karen as energetic, thoughtful, and someone who stayed in constant contact. That is why, when Karen stopped answering her phone, those closest to her immediately knew that something was seriously wrong. Monnique Lee grew up in a deeply unstable environment. From an early age, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Signs of severe behavioral and emotional instability appeared early on and were never fully addressed through consistent treatment. As an adult, Monnique became a mother of 2 and attempted to build a normal life. But she continued to struggle with frequent loss of control. Karen Jenkins entered her life first as a landlord, and over time became a source of support and stability. However, when Monnique stopped paying rent, became involved in theft, and refused to cooperate, Karen was forced to make a painful decision and issue an eviction notice. To Monnique, this was not simply a legal process. It represented a personal collapse. After receiving the eviction notice, Monnique spiraled into paranoia and resentment. She became convinced that unseen forces were watching her and that her children were about to be taken away. Within that state of confusion and fear, Monnique and her brother, Gary Lee, began to form a plan. They contacted Karen and told her that Gary was interested in renting another apartment. It was a request Karen had no reason to doubt. When she arrived at the location, there was no potential tenant waiting. Only the two siblings were there. As Karen turned away, Monnique attacked from behind. Using a cord from a household appliance, she applied force to restrain Karen, while Gary held her in place. Karen cried out, calling Monnique by name and begging her to stop, but the situation did not end there. After Karen became unresponsive, Monnique took further actions meant to silence her completely, steps that were unnecessary, deeply disturbing, and devoid of compassion. Karen's body was then wrapped and moved across the street to an abandoned house, where it was hidden beneath a porch, as though she had never existed at all. Karen's disappearance prompted her family to contact police immediately. Clues surfaced quickly. The last call on Karen's phone had been made to Gary Lee. Monnique's statements shifted repeatedly, raising further concern. When Karen's body was eventually discovered, every remaining denial collapsed. In recorded phone calls from jail, Monnique admitted to restraining Karen and taking her life. She was heard crying, speaking about her children, and acknowledging that she would likely spend the rest of her life in prison. Those admissions cast a heavy silence over the courtroom. Monnique C. Lee was sentenced to life in prison for murder. Her brother received a lengthy sentence as an accomplice. But the verdict did not bring closure to the tragedy. Just 2 months into her sentence, Monnique died in custody in 2013, at only 29 years old. The exact circumstances were never clearly made public. The case left behind an unsettling question: what happens when untreated mental illness collides with resentment and despair? Karen Jenkins believed in people, and it was that belief that led her to an appointment from which she never returned. Number 4. John Joseph Joubert IV. In the early 1980s, in the quiet residential communities of Maine and Nebraska, parents began living with an unease they could not yet explain. Young boys left home to jog, deliver newspapers, or walk to school just as they did every day. But some of them never returned. When the first body was discovered, it was initially believed to be an accident. When a second child disappeared, fear began to take shape, and when similar injuries were later identified, it became clear that something far more troubling was happening. There was someone dangerous moving among them, unseen, unnoticed, and preying on routine and trust. John Joseph Joubert IV did not match the typical image people associate with a serial offender. He appeared thin, quiet, and reserved, speaking carefully and drawing little attention. Born in 1963, Joubert grew up in a fractured household, lived a withdrawn life, and had few close relationships. Behind that silence, however, were troubling thoughts that emerged at a very early age. In later statements, Joubert admitted that he had contemplated killing as young as 6 years old. As an adult, he joined the United States Air Force, entering an environment defined by discipline and structure. But rather than eliminating his violent urges, that rigid control helped him conceal them more effectively, allowing what lay beneath the surface to remain hidden for years. In 1982, in Maine, an 11-year-old boy named Richard disappeared while out for a run. His body was later found along a roadside. Investigators determined that he had been restrained and fatally injured. One detail deeply unsettled those working the case: marks consistent with human bite impressions. A year later, after Joubert had relocated to Nebraska, a similar pattern emerged. 13-year-old Danny was taken while delivering newspapers. He was later found bound and critically wounded in a wooded area. Once again, the same distinctive markings were present. This was no random act. The individual responsible was not only taking lives, he was leaving behind a signature. When 12-year-old Christopher disappeared on his way to school in Nebraska, the entire community fell into panic. Parents began escorting their children directly to classroom doors. Schools adjusted schedules and closed early. Law enforcement believed that if the situation was not stopped quickly, more children would be at risk. Yet the person responsible remained unseen. There was no connection to the victims, no messages, no obvious pattern left behind, only traces that were too subtle to follow. Fear spread not because of what was known, but because of what could not be seen. The turning point came from what seemed like a very small moment. A preschool teacher noticed a young man lingering near the school grounds. Her instincts told her something was not right. When the man realized he was being observed and quickly left, she managed to write down his license plate number. That vehicle was later traced back to John Joubert. During a search, investigators discovered rope consistent with the type commonly used in military settings, matching what had been used to restrain the victims. Most critically, Joubert's dental impressions were found to be a direct match to the bite marks identified during the investigations. What had once been invisible was suddenly undeniable. The evidence connected, and the person responsible could no longer remain hidden. When confronted with the evidence, Joubert did not resist for long. He confessed to the killings, describing them as a release for urges that had tormented him for years. Psychological experts later confirmed that Joubert suffered from severe personality disorders. However, they also concluded that he was fully aware of his actions. He understood what he was doing, and he made the choice to do it. The trial unfolded in a heavy and somber atmosphere. Families of the victims sat through testimony no one should ever have to hear, forced to confront details they had long hoped to avoid. John Joseph Joubert IV was sentenced to death. In 1996, his sentence was carried out in Nebraska. Before it was carried out, Joubert offered an apology to the families of the victims' words that could never undo what had already happened. The case brought a grim chapter to a close, but it left behind a difficult lesson. Sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are not loud or attention-seeking. They remain quiet, blend into everyday life, and wait until the moment they choose to release the darkness they have carried within. Number 5. Tayana Mathany. On the night of February 23, 2005, in Omaha, two men left their homes with the same expectation. They believed they were about to meet a woman who seemed interested and intimate, no strings attached encounter. Neither of them knew that behind the warm messages was a carefully prepared trap. Over the course of 2 consecutive nights, 2 lives were lost. And at the center of every meeting stood Tayana Mathany, a young woman who moved calmly through situations where the line between life and death quietly disappeared. Tayana Mathany was born in 1983 and grew up in an unstable environment. She left her family at a young age and drifted through a series of harmful relationships. When she arrived in Omaha, she became entangled with Terry Sellers, a man with a long criminal record and a pattern of aggressive behavior. Tayana was not the one directing events, but she fully understood the role she played. She was attractive, articulate, and knew how to make people feel at ease. She knew how to earn trust. To those who met her, Tayana appeared to be an opportunity. Within the plan, she served as the lure. The pattern repeated with chilling consistency. Tayana would approach men, engage them in conversation, and arrange meetings at quiet apartment complexes. When the victims arrived, Sellers and Terrell Thorpe were already waiting nearby, out of sight. The stated objective was theft. But confrontation was always part of the plan. Over time, for Tayana, the line between manipulation and lethal consequence became increasingly blurred. She was no longer a bystander to what followed. She was part of it. The first victim was led to an isolated parking area late at night. What followed unfolded rapidly. At a critical moment, Tayana was holding a firearm. In later statements, she claimed she had been forced into the situation, but the outcome was real and irreversible. The encounter ended instantly, and the man collapsed where he stood. Tayana remained at the scene. She did not flee, Just hours later, the group repeated the pattern with a second victim. Once again, the meeting ended in loss of life. 2 men were gone within less than 24 hours. At that point, confrontation was no longer merely a tool within the plan. It had become a choice. By the time of the third intended victim, the plan unraveled. The man resisted. A shot was fired but missed its mark. The struggle drew the attention of nearby residents, and police were called. The victims survived. That survival changed everything. It shattered the cover that had held until then. Within days, Tayana and the others were taken into custody. Faced with evidence that could not be denied, the question was no longer who was responsible, but who would turn on whom first. Facing the possibility of a life sentence, Tayana chose a path of survival. She provided a full account of the plan, identified the roles of Sellers and Thorpe, and acknowledged her own involvement. At the same time, she emphasized that she had been manipulated and controlled throughout the events. In court, Tayana broke down in tears. She spoke about fear, remorse, and her desire to stay alive. Prosecutors understood that without her testimony, securing convictions against the 2 men would be far more difficult. Tayana became a cooperating witness, trading the full truth for the possibility of a reduced sentence. Based largely on Tayana's testimony, Sellers and Thorpe were each sentenced to life in prison. Tayana Mathany received a sentence ranging from 35 to 70 years. Before being led away, she acknowledged that she would grow old behind bars. The case came to an end, but its bitter aftertaste remained. Not every person who takes a life acts in sudden rage. Some do so through charm, through trust carefully built and then exploited. And sometimes, betrayal is not the most shocking part. What is more unsettling is how easily a person can cross moral boundaries when survival becomes the only thing that matters. Number 6. John L. Lauder. In the early morning hours of December 31, 1993, at a remote farmhouse in Nebraska, 3 lives were taken in silence. Not because of robbery, not because of a long-standing personal dispute, but because one individual dared to live authentically. Brandon Tina, along with 2 close friends, believed the worst was finally behind them. They thought the danger had passed. But it had not disappeared. It returned only to bring everything to an end. Brandon Tina was born with a female body but lived and was known as a man. In his early 20s, Brandon left behind his past in search of a place where he could be accepted for who he truly was. In Falls City, Nebraska, Brandon found friendship, affection, and rare moments of belonging. Those who knew him described Brandon as cheerful, kind, and genuinely trying to fit in. For a time, he was simply living laughing, connecting, and existing as himself. But in a small community, difference can quickly become a target, and Brandon, who only wanted the right to exist, was instead viewed as a threat. John L. Lauder and Tom Nissen were men living on the margins of society. Unemployed, struggling with alcohol, and burdened by insecurity and anger, they carried a fragile sense of identity. For them, masculinity felt easily threatened. When they discovered that Brandon was transgender, curiosity quickly turned into hostility. They felt deceived, humiliated, and convinced themselves that force was the only way to reclaim a sense of control. In their thinking, Brandon ceased to be seen as a person and became merely an excuse for their own rage. Before the murders took place, serious harm had already occurred. Lauder and Nissen publicly confronted Brandon, exposing and humiliating him in front of others. It was not simply an act of physical aggression, it was a deliberate stripping away of dignity. They later forced Brandon into isolation, subjecting him to severe abuse meant to intimidate and silence him. He was threatened with fatal consequences if he went to the authorities. But Brandon chose to speak out anyway. He believed that the law would protect him. He believed that telling the truth was the right thing to do. When Lauder and Nissen learned that Brandon had reported what happened to the police, their fear turned into resolve, not fear of guilt, but fear of exposure. They drank heavily, armed themselves, and returned to the farmhouse where Brandon was staying with friends. The door was forced open. Within moments, 3 lives were lost. Brandon was killed. The 2 friends who were with him were also taken simply because they were there. Because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was an ending driven not by necessity, but by the refusal to face accountability. Lotter and Nissen were arrested shortly afterward. In court, the truth emerged in stark detail. This was not an impulsive act. It was a deliberate killing, carried out to silence a witness. The jury listened in heavy silence as the facts were laid out. To prosecutors, the crime was driven by hatred and fear of difference. To Brandon's family, it represented the collapse of their belief that their child could be protected. The courtroom became a place not only of judgment, but of mourning for a life taken, and for the trust that had been shattered. John L. Lotter was sentenced to death. Tom Nissen received a life sentence. But no verdict could bring Brandon back. The case became a painful symbol of hate-driven crime in the United States. Years later, Brandon's story was brought to a wider audience through the film Boys Don't Cry, not for shock, but as a reminder of the devastating consequences of silence and prejudice. Brandon Teena did not die because he did something wrong. He died because he chose to live honestly. And that truth is what makes this case impossible to forget. Number 7. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. In November 2017, Sydney Loof, 24 years old, left her home to meet someone she had connected with through a dating app. She told friends she was looking forward to a pleasant evening, a possible new beginning. It was the last time Sydney was seen alive. When she failed to return home, her phone went silent, and her social media activity stopped. Concern slowly turned into fear. What no one yet realized was that behind what appeared to be an ordinary meeting was a carefully constructed trap, and Sydney had become the next target. Sydney Loof was a young, independent woman, open-minded, energetic, and full of life. She worked hard, loved traveling, enjoyed music, and valued long conversations with friends. Her family described Sydney as warm and compassionate, someone who always tried to see the good in others. Like many people her age, Sydney believed in making connections online. She saw a date as nothing more than a chance to get to know someone new. That trust, however, brought her into the orbit of two individuals who never intended for her to leave safely. Aubrey Trail was the driving force behind everything. He was manipulative, controlling, and fueled by distorted fantasies of power and dominance. Bailey Boswell, younger and more easily influenced, became both his partner and a tool within his control. Together, they existed in a closed world of their own, one where harmful behavior was masked by vague ideas about intimacy, belief, and submission. In their view, other people were not individuals with inherent worth, but objects meant to serve their darker desires. Sydney's remains were not discovered right away. Instead, they were separated and placed across multiple rural locations. This was not a moment of panic or confusion. It reflected calculation. The efforts to conceal what had happened were carried out deliberately, with structure and intent designed to erase evidence and delay discovery. While Sydney's family waited desperately for answers, those responsible continued with their lives as if no one had vanished at all. When arrested, Trail showed no remorse. He spoke at length, attempting to steer the narrative toward an accident shaped by distorted beliefs. But the evidence did not support his version of events. Messages, location data, witness statements, and the manner in which the situation was handled afterward all pointed to a carefully planned homicide. Bailey Boswell initially denied her involvement. In time, however, the truth emerged. She was not only influenced by Trail, she actively participated in creating the deadly trap. Aubrey Trail was sentenced to death. Bailey Boswell received a life sentence. But no verdict could ever fill the absent Sydney Loof left behind. Her family lost a daughter, her friends lost someone they loved, and society was forced to confront a troubling reality. While technology connects people, it can also be exploited by those with harmful intent. Sydney Loof did not lose her life because of carelessness. She lost it because she trusted that a date would be safe. That is the painful lesson this case leaves behind, and one that should not be forgotten. Number 8. Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. In early 1958, Nebraska was unfamiliar with the idea of a mass killing. But in just a few short days, 11 lives were lost. Not through war, not through natural disaster, but through the actions of two teenagers, one driven by deep resentment and destructive impulses, and the other a 14-year-old girl caught in his orbit. What followed was a journey that began in a quiet home and ended as a long-lasting trauma etched into American history, an episode that would haunt the nation for decades to come. Charles Starkweather, 19 years old, grew up in poverty, endured persistent bullying, and carried a simmering anger toward the world around him. He became fixated on the image of outlaws, convinced that force was the only way to assert his existence. To Starkweather, society itself was the enemy, and taking lives became an act of defiance in his mind. When he met Carol Ann Fugate, a girl just 14 years old, Starkweather did not simply find a girlfriend. He found someone who would be compelled to accompany him, an unwilling witness drawn into the chaos he was determined to unleash. The spree began with an act few could comprehend. Starkweather killed Carol's parents and her younger sister inside their own home. 3 lives were lost, and Carol was forced to witness the aftermath. In the days that followed, Starkweather kept Carol inside the house, misleading neighbors by claiming the family was ill in order to conceal what had happened. It was the moment from which there was no return. The line had been crossed. What followed was not escape, but flight, and attempt to outrun consequences that were already unavoidable. In the days that followed, Starkweather and Carol moved across Nebraska and into Wyoming. Anyone who crossed their path could become a target: friends, acquaintances, or complete strangers. There was no clear pattern and no hesitation. In total, 11 lives were lost. Starkweather acted with a disturbing sense of purpose, as if carrying out a mission. Carol remained at his side, surviving in a state of fear, shock, and emotional paralysis. Across the country, Americans followed the unfolding reports with a level of horror rarely seen before, struggling to comprehend how such a trail of devastation could happen so suddenly and so close to home. The flight came to an end when police stopped Starkweather's vehicle and took him into custody. He surrendered not out of remorse, but because there was nowhere left to go. Shortly afterward, Carol Ann Fugate was also arrested. In public statements, Starkweather claimed full responsibility for what had happened. But in official records and inside the courtroom, Carol's role became the subject of intense debate. She maintained that she had been threatened, controlled, and unable to escape. At the time, however, the legal system was not prepared to recognize or fully address that level of complexity. Charles Starkweather was sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair in 1959. He was only 21 years old. Carol Ann Fugate received a life sentence. After 17 years, she was granted parole and returned to society, carrying a past that could never truly be erased. The Starkweather-Fugate case went on to inspire numerous films and works of art, not because of romance, but because it forces society to confront one of its most difficult questions. When violence begins at such a young age, the line between perpetrator and victim can become frighteningly thin. And that is why, more than half a century later, Nebraska has never forgotten. Number 9. Jessica Reed and Quiana Childress. In August 2007, in the small town of Murdock, Nebraska, a peaceful morning ended in an unsettling silence. Wayne and Charmin Stock, a farming couple deeply respected throughout the community, failed to appear as they normally did. When police entered their home, what they found left everyone stunned. 2 people who had spent their lives surrounded by farmland, family, and kindness had been killed inside their own house. No one could understand why they had been targeted. Even more disturbing was the fact that the earliest clues seemed to point in the wrong direction, suggesting that the truth was far more complicated than anyone initially believed. Wayne and Charmin Stock were a familiar presence in rural Nebraska. They were hardworking, private, and lived with quiet integrity. Their home was not extravagant, but a place built through years of labor and care. They helped neighbors, believed in decency, and rarely felt the need to lock their doors. Family members and friends could not understand how 2 people who had never made enemies could become targets of such an act. For the community of Murdock, their deaths were more than a personal loss. They marked the collapse of a shared sense of safety, one that had defined the town for generations. In the early hours of the investigation, police were under intense pressure. The scene suggested signs of a struggle, and some early indicators appeared to point toward people close to the victims. suspicion quickly shifted to those within their immediate circle. The victims' family members were suddenly pulled into a painful spiral, grieving their loss, while also facing questioning and doubt. It was a moment that revealed one of the harsh realities of criminal investigations when the truth is still unclear. Even those closest to the victims can become subjects of suspicion. While suspicion moved in the wrong direction, two other names remained quietly outside the frame. Jessica Reed and Tayana Childress, two teenage girls from Wisconsin. They were young, unfamiliar to the town, and appeared to have no connection to the victims. But that very unfamiliarity became the perfect cover. According to later statements, Wayne and Sharman Stock were not specific targets. The girls were simply looking for a house to break into. A reckless decision led them to a front door that should never have been opened. The turning point in the case came from seemingly minor details. A ring bearing traces that did not belong there, an abandoned vehicle with no connection to the victims. Disconnected pieces began to align. Investigators followed the trail and discovered that two young women had been in the area at the time of the crime. During questioning, inconsistencies in their accounts gradually surfaced. Physical evidence does not fabricate stories, and neither does the truth when it begins to emerge. In the end, Jessica Reed and Tayana Childress admitted that they had been inside the house that day. They stated that their original intention was burglary. But once they were discovered, the situation quickly spiraled beyond control. What followed was a sudden escalation. Two elderly individuals, unable to defend themselves, lost their lives during the confrontation. The admission did nothing to lessen the gravity of the crime. Instead, it revealed a chilling truth. Sometimes, death does not come from personal hatred, but from reckless choices and a profound lack of regard for human life. Jessica Reed and Tayana Childress were sentenced to life in prison. No parole. No second chance. The trial came to an end, but the wounds left behind did not. The victim's family lost two pillars of their lives. A town lost its long-held sense of safety. And the justice system was forced to confront a difficult lesson. The truth can sometimes be obscured by early assumptions. Wayne and Sharman Stock did not lose their lives because they trusted the wrong people. They lost their lives because they believed their home was the safest place they had. And that sense of safety was something that could never be restored. Number 10. Anthony Garcia. Some crimes happen in sudden moments of impulse. Others are nurtured quietly over many years. Anthony Garcia belonged to the latter. In 2008, a family in Omaha lost their young son in a mysterious killing. The person responsible vanished without a trace. 5 years later, in 2013, another family was found dead under deeply disturbing circumstances. This time, the final pieces began to fall into place. Two cases, 5 years apart, but driven by a single motive: revenge. Anthony Garcia was once a physician. He was formally trained, well-educated, and had worked within respected medical institutions. But behind the credentials and the white coat was a man consumed by resentment. Garcia could not tolerate failure. When he received poor evaluations and was dismissed from a residency program at Creighton University, he did not see it as a reflection of his performance. Instead, he became convinced that he was the victim of betrayal and humiliation. From that point on, in Garcia's mind, those who had criticized him were no longer colleagues. They became enemies. In March 2008, Dr. William Hunter returned home to a scene no parent should ever have to face. His young son and a longtime family caregiver had been killed. Nothing of value was taken. No message was left behind. The scene suggested a deeply personal motive, marked by intense emotion rather than robbery or random violence. Yet at the time, investigators were unable to identify a clear connection or suspect. The case slowly went cold. For the Hunter family, the pain remained without answers. For Garcia, it was only the beginning. Over the next 5 years, Garcia lived quietly. He drew no attention. He showed no outward signs of aggression. But that silence was not forgetfulness. It was waiting. Garcia carried with him a mental list of people he believed had ruined his life. He observed, he remembered, and he remained patient. For him, revenge did not need to be rushed. It needed to be precise. In May 2013, Dr. Roger Brumbach and his wife were found dead inside their own home. Once again, the circumstances pointed to a deeply personal act. There were no signs of theft. Nothing suggested randomness. Investigators began to notice striking similarities to the unsolved case from 2008. This time, however, digital evidence began to speak. Search histories, driving routes, credit card records, quiet data trails that all led back to one name, someone who had previously gone unnoticed. Anthony Garcia. When Garcia was taken into custody, he did not appear panicked. But the evidence left no room for doubt. Digital records placed him near the crime scenes. His travel patterns aligned closely with the timelines of the attacks. Personal documents revealed a deep fixation on those who had once evaluated and rejected him. The full picture gradually came into focus. This was not a series of random acts. It was a calculated campaign of revenge, carried out over 5 years by someone who understood patience, concealment, and how to wait for the right moment. Anthony Garcia was sentenced to death for the loss of 4 lives. But no verdict could restore what was taken. 2 families were destroyed not by chaos, but by one man's refusal to accept his own failure. The case stands as a chilling warning. Intelligence does not equal humanity. And when resentment is allowed to grow unchecked, it can become more dangerous than any impulsive act. Anthony Garcia did not act in madness. He acted with calculation. And that is what makes this case especially haunting.